welcome to another session on React hooks. So in the previous session in which we studied states in React, we saw that how we got stuck in one particular scenario in which we had two buttons and we were not able to strike and unstrike, or basically change our condition on based on that particular user interaction with our web app. So in this particular session, we'll try to achieve that particular one using React hooks. So let's get into our code sandbox. I hope you are able to see it now. So in front of us, it is a very basic app, and what we hope to achieve via this is, first of all, we have a number right here. In the initial sandbox, I have hard coded it, so it's simply 0 in a h1 tag that is being displayed here as it is. And down below, we have a button, which now the intention or the agenda of ours via this code is that we want that every time we click on this particular button, we want this number to get incremented by 1. So it is sort of a counter, which means if I press this button 5 times, then this number should become 5. So how can we proceed in order to achieve this? First of all, let's fork out this sandbox, and let me just rename it so that I can later provide the sandbox link to you as well. So the first thing that we should do in this particular case is change this 0 from a hard-coded one to, let's say, we have a variable count which is initially 0. And now what we are doing is we are rendering count dynamically by the use of these curly braces. So in here you can see there's no big change in here, but now we can see what happens is this particular 0 is not a hard-coded one and it is getting rendered from the value of count. Okay, now the next thing what we can think of is, because we are clicking on this particular button and on this particular event, that means when a click is getting executed, then I want to do something. So that suggests that we should be using the on-click listener on our button. So what I can do is I can say on-click is equals to some function. Let's call our function increase for now, and let's try to define our function here. Now in here, what we can do is, in order to check that this particular function is which means the code sandbox is able to acknowledge whenever I'm clicking this button, we are simply going to write clicked. Okay, let's open our console, and then if every time we click on this particular button, you can see this clicked is now being displayed on our console. So which means that okay, this particular thing is done. Now applying the previous logic that we applied in the previous session of ours, someone might say that okay, why not do just this? If we simply increment the count, and let's say we log this count here as well in order to further cross check it. So initially our count is 0. Okay, let's say we refresh this once. Initially our count is 0, as we can see, and once we click on this particular button, you can see now the count is incremented by 1 and the value is 1, again 2, 3, 4, 5. So one thing is for sure, that this particular function is indeed getting called whenever I'm clicking on this particular button, and the variable of count, it is also incrementing with every press of this particular button. But the problem is that we are not able to see it on our screen. And as discussed in the previous session, we know that it is because this particular component, or let's say this particular div of ours, in this scenario is not getting re-rendered. Okay, or let's say this particular h1 of ours, it is the one that is initially rendered, and then count is incrementing behind the scenes. So what we can do is, we can, in order to re-render this particular entire component of ours forcefully, we can simply take this particular part and let's say we put it inside a return statement. Now what happens if we now click on this particular part? I think we are supposed to put this entire React render code here. Okay, let's try and put it like this. So what we are basically doing is, we took this entire code of React DOM.render, and once we are done incrementing our count, we are again rendering it from each and every element. Okay, now let's try and check whether this particular thing works or not. So now if I click on this plus button, you can see the counter is increasing. Okay, and if I click it n number of times, then this particular value of mine will be n itself. But if you see this particular code that we have now, so what we basically did was, it was a very brute force of a solution. We picked the entire render code and then we pasted it inside our function. So what are the shortcomings of this particular code, or what are the problems due to which we should avoid using such code? First of all, it is very inefficient, because you can see every time I'm incrementing count, instead of, because React had that particular ability of just re-rendering those particular components which are changed as compared to the previous DOM. But in this case of ours, the entire page is getting re-rendered. Okay, and the second thing is, you can see this entire 5 or 6 lines of code are repeating, and it is a very bad coding practice to have so much repetitiveness in your code. Now what can we do in place of this? So the first thing that we are supposed to do is, let's put this entire code of ours inside app.jsx, so that we can clear all this mess out of our index.js. So let's remove this one. We head over to app. Let's just try to paste it here. Removing this, let's take our count variable along this, like this. And then what we need to do is, inside of our function app, okay, I think we messed up something. Okay, now what are we doing right here is, we are having our function. First of all, let's import this app in here from components/app. So now it knows where this app is, and inside this app, let's say we are declaring a variable count, which is initially 0. Then we have our function of increase, and when we are here, let's cut this entire part out, paste it like this, get rid of this entire code in here, and if we simply log count like we did previously, if I hit save once here and save once here, and now if we see opening the console, if I'm clicking this particular button, the count is getting incremented, but we are not re-rendering our entire these page right here, or this entire div of ours. So what we can do in this particular scenario is, Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a particular stuff which is indeed the React hook, and the name of that particular hook is called useState. So what we are going to do is, instead of understanding from starting what this hook is, we are going to reverse engineer it. Okay, I'm going to just use it out of the blue, and then we'll try to break it apart. We'll try to reverse engineer it and try to understand what it is, what it's comprised of, and how we can use it to our advantage in this particular case. Okay, so the first thing is, in order to use this React hook of useState, we can first declare a constant of, let's say, state, and type React useState like this. Okay, now since this particular use state of ours, let me remove this. Now since this particular useState hook, it comes from this React module of ours. So instead of using this React dot operator, what we can do is we can include it inside our code sandbox by use of this as a non-default. Okay, so this way you will be able to get rid of that React dot operator, and let's say initially I'm putting 0 here. Okay, so that it stops throwing that error here like this. So now you can see what I basically did was I used a constant of state, and then I put it equal to this particular hook. So first let's see what this actually is. If I put it equal to some particular constant, what we get right here. So now we can see, see what we did was, initially we just took this particular use state. We knew that we get this hook from our React modules, and in order to include it in our particular code sandbox, we'll import it as a non-default, and then we'll use it by equating it to a constant, and then we are console logging it in order to see what actually this hook is, because up till now this is sort of a black box for us. Okay, and once we log it onto our console, we are able to see that it consists of two elements. The first one is a value which is initially undefined, and the second element is a function which sort of performs some action. Now let's see what both of these are one by one. So actually the first element inside here is the initial value with which we can initialize our state. So what I mean by this is, if I write 10 here, let's say, and if we check our console, then you can see that the initial value of ours for this particular state will be 10. If I write, let's say, something right here, then that something will become the initial value of our state. Now what I mean by this is, let's say I make it 200, and then in here, if I use it as my state like this, now if you see this, the initial value of my state is going to be 200. All right, and in order to use this particular because it is throwing some sort of error, it is because what this state actually is we can see that once we equate it equals to use state, it is actually an array. All right, you can see that it is represented by these box braces, and in order to point to the first element of this, we can write it like state of 0. So now you can see that particular error is gone. So what we mean by this state 0 is, we are referring to the first element of our state. And since we wrote 200 here, let's say we write 10 here, and we check console, then we can see that the initial element, the first element of our state, is going to be 10, and the second one is some function which we still don't know what this particular function is. Okay. Now another problem is that this sort of coding convention is a very bad one, because if you are simply writing something 0, it doesn't mean anything. All right. Now, since this particular code is only like 19 lines long or even less, because there are spaces in between, we have no issue, because we are simply able to understand, okay, we have one constant of state and it consisted of 2 elements. The array consisted of 2 elements. The first one was a value, and in order to access that first element, we are writing state 0. But if this particular code gets bigger and larger, the problem is down the line we'll start forgetting what this actually stands for. And in here we can I would also like to introduce the concept of destructuring, the array destructuring, object destructuring. So what destructuring means is, we can break down some complex data structure or some complex storage, in this case this array of ours, and we can basically assign different variables to each and every element of that particular storage or structure of ours. Now what I mean by that is, let's say I have an array called A, and since it's an array, I'm going to represent it by these box symbols, and it consists of value 10, 20 and 30. Now if I want to get hold of this 10, okay, now let's say these 3 are some distances from a particular point. So this particular first element of this array A is distance 1, this is distance 2, and this is distance 3. Now if I want to get hold of a particular distance, let's say if I want to get hold of distance 1, then I will be forced to write A of 0 like this. And if we check in our console, you can see that A of 0 is 10. Okay. And if okay, let me make it like this. And if I want to get hold of the second element, then I will have to write 1, and the third one like this. Since it is an array, the indexing will start from 0, so 0, 1 and 2. But if I'm going to use it somewhere down the line, okay, let's say if I write it somewhere here where I'm not able to see the basic initialization of our array A, so at that particular point it really gets confusing. So what array destructuring does is, we can basically use something like this. Let's say instead of writing this, I remove it, and then I have an array similar to the previous one like this, and corresponding to each element that I have here. Now instead of just naming this array some variable like A or ARR, what I can do is I can write it something like this, putting a comma in between. Now what it will do is, it will basically assign each subsequent element respective to the position of whatever variable or constant we are declaring here, right? In this particular case, the distance 1 will be assigned the value of 10, the distance 2 will be assigned the value of 20, and distance 3 will be assigned the value of this. And how it helps us is, now if I want to get hold of the first distance, because the array A of ours was representing the distances from a particular point, okay. Now I want to know what the distance 1 was. So instead of writing A of 0, which doesn't mean anything, I can write distance 1, which clearly mentions which thing I'm actually referring to. Similarly for distance 2, and similarly for distance 3. Okay. So this is basically how we can assign or basically destructure, and you can write of course like this as well. So here what I did was, I basically just replaced the array with the name of A, or you can directly write it like that also. So distance 2 will give me 20, 1 will give me 10. So basically what I did was, I destructured my data structure, in this case, which was an array. And for every subsequent element of that, instead of representing it using the indexing of our array, I just used some variables and naming them very cleverly in order for them to make sense in the long run. So now, instead of using state here, what we can do is we know that this particular use state is an array that consists of two entries. The first element is a constant. Let's say we call this first entry of ours count, and the second one was a function. So since this is an optional one, let's remove this, and now instead of writing state 0, I'm going to write count here. And always, whenever in doubt, you can always console log in order to check what this particular variable is. So yeah, count is 10, and we can further verify it by console logging it. And even in the h1 tag of ours, we can see that it is displaying the initial value of our state. Okay, so now we are able to understand half the part of this use state hook. It will provide us with an array consisting of two parts. The first one is going to be the initial value, and the second one was the function. So what we can do in order to update our state's value, okay, because up till now we are able to just set the initial part. Even if we press this button, the stuff that we actually wanted to achieve was to update this particular count of ours. So actually, the function that we had when we tried to console log the state initially, that particular function is responsible with updating this initial state of ours. What I mean by that is, let's say the function that we have, I call it set count, okay, and this set count function of ours, what I do is, whenever the function with this particular button is pressed, this function increase is going to get called. So in here, what I can do is I can call that particular function, and once you call this function, inside the parameters, inside these braces of this function, the value that you put, the initial state that you had when you initialize this hook of ours, it will get updated to whatever value you put here. Let's say I put 20 here, okay, irrespective of whatever here is. Let's say here it is 33333, like this, okay, you can see it. Okay, now what I'm claiming is, when I will click this button right here, this on click listener will get triggered. It will make a call to this increase function. Once we are inside this increase function, it will give a call to this set count function, which was the second element of our use state hook, the array that is returned by this use state hook. And then inside the parameters that we pass, whatever we put inside this particular function of ours, the current state, that is count in our case, will be set to this particular value. So in order to verify it, if I click on this button, you can see the value changes to 20. Now since I'm passing a constant here, now after pressing it once, no matter how many times I click on this button, it is not going to change. But what we actually wanted was, we wanted it to increment this count by 1. So instead of writing 20 here, what we can do is, we can simply write the initial state, that was count, plus 1. And now if I initialize it back to 0, and now if I keep pressing this particular button, you can see that each time this increase function is called, this set count function will get triggered, and it will update our current state to its initial value plus 1. And if you want to, let's say, create some sort of an even counter, what you can do is, let's say if we hit save and we reload this app of ours, and now every time it hit this particular button, this count value will get incremented by 2. You can say 2, 4, 6, 8. So it becomes sort of an even counter in this case. So now we fully understand what this useState hook does. It basically lets you hook through the current state that you have and update it using this particular function that you can use wherever you want, wherever you need in your code of ours. Now what I want you to do further in this particular code is try to create another button, like the way when we click on this button, the current state of ours gets incremented by 1. This count variable gets incremented by 1. I want you to put another button here with minus sign instead of +1, and whenever I click that minus button, this particular current count of mine, it should decrease by 1. Like the way it is incrementing by 1, it should decrease by 1. So it's a very simple task. Just pause this now and give it a go. Alright, so the first thing is we need to create a button, and let's change its sign to minus. And now let's say we create another function and we call it decrease. So let's paste it like this and call it decrease. And now just what we want to do is we just replace the plus symbol with the -1, which means every time this decrease function is triggered and this set count function is called, the current count of ours should get decremented by 1. So now if I press this plus button, the count will get incremented, and if I press this minus button, the count will get decremented. Okay. So in order to summarize this, let me press Ctrl S here. Let me switch displays now. Okay, so in order to summarize, what we learned in this particular session was that all of this was achieved by our useState hook, and it comes from importing it from React modules in the top, as you saw, and then we make it equal to a particular constant or a variable, which actually is an array consisting of 2 parts. The first one is the initial value or the initial state of our whatever variable we are using. So it is called the initial state of that particular variable of ours, and the second one is a function. Now wherever we are using that state of ours, that function is used to update that state, and in this particular case we called it set count. You can call it whatever you want, and that particular function can be used anywhere in your code in order to update that initial value of yours. So this way we were able to update that particular variable of ours, and then it always get re-rendered. It compares it with the previous code of ours, and then since only that particular portion in which we were dynamically rendering that count of ours, only that particular region was updated because the count got incremented or decremented by 1. So that particular part gets re-rendered, and we get rid of that extra code in which we were forced to explicitly re-render the entire div of ours. So I hope you were able to understand useState hook to practice it, whatever this incrementing and decrementing one that we already discussed in this sandbox, and you can play around with it, trying to multiply, divide, or do whatever you want just by use of this onClick, or let's say any other sort of listener. And in addition to this, in the next session we'll be having a little practice to build a little bit of more of these muscle memory of ours with respect to this useState hook, and in order to further understand how it can be, let's say, it can be used to the next level without the updating the app without the user interfering with your UI. So in order to see that, I'll see you in the next one.